Welcome. My name is William Messakar. I am a master model railroader in the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. I want to welcome all of you to the virtual layout tour we'll have presented today by members of the NMRA. We would encourage you to find out about the NMRA and join in order to participate in these virtual tours. We have other virtual clinics and other activities for the National Model Railroad Association that we think you'll find a big help to your modeling, and you'll get to meet model railroaders just like you. So welcome to our tour, and I hope you enjoy it.
So I'm Greg Wright, and I'm going to talk about my Consolidated Republic Mining Railway. And I'm going to do that through looking at the mines and the mills that make up this whole thing. So let me go through just a little bit introduction of who I am and how I got to where I am with this model railroad. I've been a model railroader since grade school. Best I can figure out, somewhere along in there I got the Lionel train set. Both my father and grandfather worked for the railroad. My dad worked for the Northern Pacific, which then became the Burlington Northern. He retired right before the merger with the Santa Fe. Grandpa worked for the SP&S, spent a lot of time building track. He never really retired. Even though he stopped working for the railroad, SP&S, he kept working on small spurs and things around the Pasco, Kennewick, Richland area. He was their track maintenance guy, and actually one summer I worked with him and did that. He worked, I mostly watched because I didn't know what I was doing. That's a picture of the Spokane Street Tower. And some of you from the Seattle area might recognize that. That was down near the Kingdome area. And as about a 5-year-old, Dad would take me down there, and I got to hold the train orders out the window as the trains came by on the hoop. And so I've been around the railroad stuff for quite a while. I mentioned my modeling history. On the bottom there is my first Lionel train, sort of. I destroyed the engine, but the tender and the caboose actually are from the original train. On the upper left, that's some stuff that I built in high school. That's a very old Mantua Pacific kit that was all metal, including the tender that was given to me. And then I put every brass detail part I could afford on it to come up with that locomotive, and some of them were even in the right places. And the caboose in the center was a caboose I built sometime during high school when I was with a Tri-Cities Model Railroad Club. And over on the right are some HON3 models. I was quite deep into HON3 before I changed to this larger scale that I work in now. So there's some pictures of my HON3. Upper left is a module, fully contained. It had sound long before sound was available in the locomotives. It had reed switches and some recorded sounds. If you see on that little deck there right in front of the module, there's a piece of paper. On that piece of paper, it told people to look for certain things within the scene, but it was also the cover for a speaker. The sound of the train would come out there, and it confused people just enough that they believed that the sound was coming from the train. Over on the right's a close-up of a Woodland Scenic Station off of that module. And in the lower section is the engine house that I built. So I had reached the point in HON3 that I had starting on a room size layout. But every time I built that layout, it came out looking more like Colorado than I wanted. And so I eventually went away from HON3. But those are some of the models. I don't have all of those models still. Some of those went away at swap meets. Current status as a modeler, I was fortunate enough to retire a year ago. That was about 2 weeks after retirement on a trip down to the Narrow Gauge Convention in Sacramento. On the way back, we stopped and snapped this picture. Been enjoying retirement, I guess. This has been a strange year, as everyone knows. So we'll see what happens in the rest of my retirement. So as a modeler, I've been an MMR since 2017. Thanks to the work of guys like Jack Hamilton to come down and do the evaluation. I'm the lead for the Olympia Clinic, so we have a large group of modelers down here. A lot of them show up for our monthly meetings. We have one of the local county buildings. It's been going pretty well for a number of years now, started by some others. We do a function called Ole Ops every year, except this year, where we invite people to come down and operate. We have about 10 operating railroads in this area, and you rotate from one, you get 2 layouts in that day, and we rotate you through year by year. So you get a full day of operations on 2 different layouts. And we were talking about N scale earlier and my large scale. For the guys that get assigned to Jim Yonkin's N scale layout and then my layout on the same day, it's a little bit of a confusing time for them to go from really little to really big, or vice versa. I've also been the layout coordinator and scheduler for Sound Rail. That's an every 2-year event, has a national draw. That's been a lot of fun. Unfortunately, we canceled Sound Rail about a week before it was to start this year, as COVID-19 was really getting going. So we hope to be back in 2 years and redo that. I've been fortunate enough to present a number of regional conventions, presented the National Narrow Gauge Convention, and I presented at an NMRA convention. So I really enjoy doing that. It's a great fun. I've written a few articles that have also been published over time. So it's a lot of fun to share the hobby. This is not quite the same as sharing it in person. I really enjoy doing layout tours, but this is giving us a chance at least to keep our groups together. So I really appreciate everybody that signed on today to watch. So my current layout, 1/32 scale. As much as I liked HON3, as I was saying, I kept getting a Colorado style narrow gauge railroad, and that's not what I wanted. There were plenty of HON3 or ON3 or SN3 Colorado railroads around. I wanted to do something different, and I liked the idea of a mining tram. So I played around with some things, and I eventually settled on 1/32 scale. And because of that, it forced me into doing a smaller railroad, a small, something like a tram. And I really like the Gilpin tram down in Colorado, and the Pinos Altos in Silver City in New Mexico. Those were both 2-foot narrow gauge mining railroads that really capture what I'm doing. And the way the history runs on those, the Gilpin ended in the teens, the Pinos Altos ended in the 20s. I'm modeling in the 30s, so it makes sense that I can have a few pieces of their equipment have been shipped up to the Northwest where my model is. I'm modeling in an area just north of Ellensburg, up into the mountains there. And if anybody knows of the town of Liberty, it's a ghost town in central Washington. They actually had a bit of mining activity. That's where my mythical model railroad is. So that's a picture of 2 of my mines. That's about a 25-foot wall. I have 1 bay of a 3-car garage that finished off that has my railroad. So 25 feet of mines. Eye level on that is about where the base of that big head frame is. So when you walk into my railroad room, because it's a garage with a 9-foot ceiling, the buildings tower over the top of you. And that was really something specific I wanted to accomplish with this railroad, so that you felt like you were standing in amongst these buildings, not looking at them from a distance. Now, the first question you might want to ask is, why am I building a mining layout in logging country? Because everybody around here seems to do logging railroads. Well, the reason is I have a geology degree. Before going to Central Washington University into paramedic school, I was at Whitworth College in Spokane, and I have a geology degree. Unfortunately, when I graduated from Whitworth, the mining industry was in a mess, mostly because of some manipulation of the market, and there were no jobs. And I figured I better find something that I could do. And I went off to Central Washington University, went to paramedic school, became a paramedic, served 35 years in the fire service, and retired last September from City of Olympia's fire chief. So that's why it's a mining railroad in logging country. And that person down there, that picture, represents my geology professor, Dr. Edwin Olson. He was about 5 feet tall, like this little guy is, and he was fearless. And if you look really close, you can see he had really, really thick glasses. So that's a tribute to him, and you'll later see one of the mines is named after him. So that's how there's a mining railroad in logging country. As part of doing that geology work, I had 2 summers of field work down in Nevada. In 1980 and 1981, I worked for US Borax. And in the first year, I was just south of Las Vegas. And in the second year, I was over by Hawthorne, kind of where the Ponderosa would have been. But part of those trips included going to the pit at Boron and also spending some time in Death Valley. So this picture is the 20 Mule Team Borax train coming out of Death Valley. And Borax was a good company. It was interesting. Unfortunately, the timing didn't work out for me to stay with them. Had I graduated a year sooner or a year later, I probably would have been a geologist. As I was searching for this picture to put in this presentation, I ran across this picture. That is an XGN or BNSF switcher working in the Boron Pit in 2013. So there's the connection to the Northwest. You just never know where stuff might show up. I don't know if anybody knows anything about that locomotive. If they mention it at the end of the presentation, I'd be interested. So along with being in Nevada for 2 summers, you got to see sunsets, sunrises, tromp around in lots of interesting places. And this is a picture I took outside Austin, Nevada. So northern Nevada, looking out over the different mountain ranges. And this is the kind of mining railroad that I really like. And this is the idea that I was working on as I built my railroad. So one of the things I want to do is help you understand the mining industry. First, you have to find the materials. And that's what I was doing with US Borax. We were prospecting, basically. One year we had a drill rig going. Another year we were literally out walking down the dry washes and looking for certain rocks and taking samples of them and packing those samples out, marking them on a map. It spends a lot of time to find the mineral. Once you find it, you have to extract it. You have to get it out of the riverbed or the waterway or underground. And then comes transportation. And there's a good place that you can insert a railroad. So my railroad, one area it does is it transports from the mines to the mills. It's at the mills that the product is reduced. And then there's another possibility to fit in transportation as it goes from the mill to the refiner. So my railroad fills those 2 gaps of transportation, and you'll see that as we go through the different pictures. Ultimately, what we're after here is profit, and so my railroad has a bank too, and we'll talk about that when we get to the end of the presentation. To understand it, you need to know that the ore travels in a certain direction. The ore travels from the mines to the mills, in my case, to a connection to the standard gauge, since I have a narrow gauge railroad, and to the smelter. That's what happens with ore that's taken out of the ground. That's a very simplified version, but that's the flow of traffic. At the same time, you've got supplies, and they're going the other direction. The supplies are coming from the suppliers through the connection to the standard gauge, and then they have to be distributed to the mills and the mines to keep the mills and the mines running. So what that does for my operations is it creates quite a bottleneck right in the middle of my railroad as supplies are going up to the mines and the mill, and ore is coming down the hill from the mines to the mill. And if you've operated on my railroad, if you end up working Millburg, that center point, you have lots of traffic going in both directions, trying to get through to keep this process running. I wanted a railroad to serve my mines. And a lot of the mines that we put on our layouts and things that are produced for us, like the Campbell's kits, are very quaint, but they're not big enough to really support a railroad by themselves. So one of the things I had to do as I was building this railroad is try to come up with some large size mining complexes to make it worthwhile to have a railroad. Neither of these mines would produce very many cars of ore per day to make it worthwhile for a whole railroad. Even this little mine, this is a prototype mine at Liberty, Washington that I talked about, wouldn't produce the kind of volume that would be needed to make a railroad feasible. So as I was putting my mines together, in my railroad, I had to figure out a way to get it a little more realistic. I love these little quaint structures, but I wasn't really able to use structures like these in my planning. Also, more modern looking. I wanted to model in the 1930s. I just set my date as 1935. As we move into the 30s, the mines and the technology changes. It goes from the all wooden structures of the previous slide to more corrugated metal. The mine on top is down in the Virginia City, Nevada area. They used a lot of corrugated metal. They have electrical power coming in. You can see those. Picture in the lower right is the Mining Museum at Butte, Montana. If you're interested in mining at all, you should stop and see that museum. It's incredible. One of the things that was real obvious there was that the head frames transitioned from wood to steel because the depths that they were going down into the ground required a lot heavier structure. So my mines needed to have at least some steel head frames. And the picture on the lower left shows that concrete eventually became the material of choice for the walls. And so trying to put all those things into my mining models helped move my era into the 1930s. So let's take a look at those mines. I have 6 mines on the railroad. The main feature mine is Redhead number 1. You might wonder where that name came from. When I painted the head frame building, that's what that thing is, it was red. And I came up with the very catchy name of Redhead number 1. When I built another mine and painted it and it came out the same color, much to my surprise, it became Redhead number 2. Not a lot of creativity, but at least I have names and people know where my mines are. So you can see in that there's a variety of different construction techniques. There's the steel head frame we talked about. There's corrugated metal. There's some wood. There's some tar paper. That building in the bottom center is where the explosives were kept. That was a real typical situation. The walls would be brick. You notice the top of that is sheet metal. So if it exploded, the force of the explosion should go up and not out and kill the miners. That was at least the hope. Mines have a lot of supporting structures, and that's another thing that I wanted to add. So in this building complex, I started adding supporting structures. Mining is hard on equipment, so there's a shop. The arrow there shows the shop with a small track going in there from inside the mine, so that the mechanics could try to keep all the different pieces working. That's also why you had to have supplies coming to the mines all the time, because they broke stuff. There also needed to be a mine office. That's the mine office building. That had a number of functions. The geologist for the mine was probably there, but it was also the place where the miners received their headlamps before they went into the mine. And it could also be the changing room. So the back of this building is set up to be the changing room. Miners would change into their mine clothes before going underground, change back out of it before leaving, partly to keep things clean, but also to make sure they weren't smuggling any high-grade ore or gold out of the mines. There's the electrical supply. I realized that when I first built this model, it didn't have all the electrical. It also didn't have the steel head frame. So after our trip to that mining museum in Butte, I came back, rebuilt the head frame, added a lot of electrical, because in the 30s, this thing would have been running off electricity and there would be lots of big cables running from building to building. So this was my attempt to simulate all those different cables that supplied power to the different buildings. And processing buildings. There were just lots of other buildings around a mine that would be processing different parts of the ore or fixing different things. So I made sure that I add a significant number of processing buildings around Redhead number 1. Mines need air. They need compressed air down below. So this is the compressor building. And you can't see it in this picture, but deep inside that building is a Cox 049 model airplane engine. The Cox engine looks an awful lot like a mine compressor. And so from my model airplane days, I salvaged one of those motors, and it sits inside that building and provides the compressed air. You can also see a big whistle there. If they needed to make a signal to the community, that was the whistle that they would blow, and then an air tank next to it. That shed on the back allows me to put more ore cars in there. This mining complex can produce, my whole railroad has 30 ore cars. That doesn't sound like a lot, but moving them forward at a time, it takes a while. And this building can hold about 10 of those ore cars in 2 tracks that are hidden up in there. So I was able to add that on afterwards. Just lots of complexity of buildings. And this is a cyanide plant down here. You can see it's cyanide by the way it's eating away that metal tank. That would be another way to extract some ore out, or some of the metal out of the ore for certain types of ore that might have been brought out from that mine. Mines have waste piles. Here's 2 small waste piles that kind of give the idea of what's going on. The lower one there is a 3D. It's part of the layout. The one in the back is painted on the backdrop. Giant waste piles would be typical. This is called a halfway house type mine, where the ore is brought up from below. There's a little bit of crushing is done to remove some of the worst of the waste. And that waste is either stacked outside or taken back down and put back in place to support the inner workings of the mine so it doesn't collapse. So I've got a couple of waste piles shown there. You got to move stuff around. So these are conveyors. And I found some very interesting products a long time ago from the Cox HO scale. They were called trainscapes, and they were these large industrial items that were probably way oversized for HO, but they were fantastic for what I was doing. So when I found these at the swap meets, I would use them for different parts of my conveyor system, and I've used them in several different scenes. That takes care of redhead number 1. I want to talk about building construction. Most of my buildings are made out of foam core. And here's a picture of foam core. It's paper with a 1/4 inch of foam inside, paper on the other side. You can draw on it. You can then cut it on one of the papers and fold it and snap it kind of like styrene. You can glue it together with white glue or hot glue. It's pretty stable. You just have to be careful not to use water-based paint on one side. If you do that, it will warp. But if you use lacquer or a spray first, you can seal that up enough that you can paint it. It makes great buildings. If you don't like how the building turned out, it's easy to cut a section off and splice another section in. It's a very interesting building material, and it makes for good solid buildings and large scale, and it would work well in anything I would think HO and above. Once I get a frame for my building, then I can put things on it. So for board and batten, I glued the battens right directly onto the foam core. For other things, I would glue plastic sheets or paper sheets or whatever material I wanted to simulate wood right to the foam core. It makes a really nice building. It's lightweight and it's very stable. Most of my buildings, I said, are made out of foam core. I'll point out the ones that aren't. So there's a place where I've cut that and folded it. You could put a piece of wood in there to firm up that corner, or you could cut it all the way through and butt glue it. There are a number of ways to form it with white glue or hot glue. Both work really well. So here's the second mine up there in this area that I call Division. This is called Republic Tunnel. A tunnel mine was something a little bit different. The mine is not here. The mine is back in the hills somewhere. And the tunnel went back in horizontally and might connect multiple different mines to bring their ore out to the railhead. So this is an idea I picked up from the Argo Tunnel. I believe it's in Nevada, the Comstock area. So my tunnel goes back into the hills off the layout, collects ore and brings it out to this railhead. So this main building would be an elevator to get supplies up to the small rail line that's up there. And then all the ore is dumped into this very large concrete poured bins. So the rail cars from my railroad come in underneath there, come from the right through a tunnel to underneath that building, underneath those great big bins. And that's where the ore is loaded. And another 10 or so ore cars can reside in this area. I poured that bunker out of plaster, made some forms and specifically wanted that wide line between the forms because old forms leaked a lot at their seam lines, and that was the effect I was trying to get there. They also wouldn't have poured that in one pour. They would have poured 10 or 12 feet, stopped, and poured again. And if you look really close, you can see that at about 10 or 12 feet, there's a really thick, bad seam. I put that bad seam there on purpose. I wanted it to look as if they'd stopped pouring and then started re-pouring. So you see that repeated several times up the building. As I said, the main building there is Foamcore, the rest of it's cast plaster. This is the Mainline mine because it sits right on the main line, another catchy name, but it's also going to be an aerial tram at some point. I haven't done that yet. This is a temporary stand-in building. But you can see there's where the aerial tram would go up that valley to a mine that's somewhere off the layout, somewhere on the backdrop off the layout. It brings more opportunity for ore cars to be stationed here to be able to take the ore down to the mills, and we'll get to the mills here shortly. This is a stand-in building. I printed this wood-looking paper on my computer printer, something I found. I threw a few pieces of balsa on it and colored it and added some gates. It's a stand-in for now. It needs to be a little bit taller and a little bit more substantial, and it needs the mechanism and the machinery for the aerial tram built inside of it. So that's a project for the future. This is redhead number 2 I talked about. That is an old Walters kit of some sort that I picked up at a hobby shop that was going out of business. It was some processing building of some sort. I brought it home, cut it apart, put it together, and this sits way up in a corner, quite a ways from the viewer, but it creates another mine. And it's metal looking, so it creates a newer looking mine. The head frame on that used to be the head frame that sat on redhead number 1. I repainted it to look a little less wooden and put it up on redhead number 2 in the distance here to get my second big mine. So along this 25-foot wall, there are 4 different mining complexes, all served by the railroad. There's the head frame. One of the things that I found doing research and working for the Summers is that mining claims tended to overlap and be really close to each other early on. And then as they would consolidate, a company would buy out multiple claims and put multiple mines in the same place. And that was one of the things I wanted to create in my prototype. That's why there's 4 mines that are somewhat different but interconnected along the wall of my railroad, to give that prototype feel that these were multiple different mines at one point, different claims, and then they were brought together. One of the companies that shows up on some of these buildings is Republic. The mill is called Republic and the tunnel is called Republic. I consolidated them together. That's where I got the name Consolidated Republic Mining Company. If you're going to have a lot of mines in one place, you need an office. So this is the office for the Consolidated Republic Mining Company at Division. This is where a lot of the work happens. There's a switcher assigned here that pulls the ore cars from all these 4 mines. But I realized that my building was wrong when I was on a trip. So this is from the Sacramento narrow gauge trip last year that I went on right after I retired. And this is the Empire Mines outside of Grass Valley, California. Beautiful complex of buildings. A lot of the miners that came to this area were Cornish, and they brought this stone construction with them and built the offices very substantial, much better than the building I had built for my offices. When I saw this building, I remembered a building that I had seen in some of the kits that I use that come out of the Ukraine. They're 1/35th scale military kits. You can interchange 1/35th and 1/32nd scale quite easily. So here is the kit that I remembered. Very similar, and it will fit where my current office is. So I'm going to take 2 of these kits actually to come up with something much more substantial as my mine office, similar to what I saw there at Empire Mine in California. So that's a project coming along here soon. I mentioned Dr. Olson. On the other corner of my room, in an area that's unfinished so far, I have the mine called Olson Pit. This isn't right over a staging area right now, so it's completely unfinished. It's just a place for operations, but it will eventually get some mining built, and here's what I'm hoping to build. Now, you may be wondering how I'm going to put that in such a small space. What I intend to do is use a mirror on the wall, and only half of that will be modeled. And the other half will project on the wall, and you'll be able to look in and see this mining pit. And very typical, when the mine started to play out and the costs went up, sometimes they would go ahead and just start digging a big hole to connect all the different mines. And you can see up on the upper left corner, that's where the surface mine used to be, but now they're digging down to find the ore. And that's going to be one of the new features of my railroad eventually. That's the only space I really have left to expand the railroad. That mill, or that mine right now, it does have some supporting structures. This was interesting. Clever Models creates a number of paper models that you can download off the internet. The beautiful printing. I took one of their O-scale models, made multiple copies. They have some freebies that they give away. This was one of them. Made multiple copies and built this building. You can layer the windows and the doors. The only 3D piece on that is the beam sticking out at the top and the chain hanging there. Otherwise, that's a completely flat piece of paper that was printed and stuck there for right now. This mine also has a very small office, a leftover piece of an outdoor railroad I had. If you look real close, it says Gilpin Mines because of my connection to Gilpin. And a mine can also have a good place for a transfer dock. So there's a small transfer dock here. All of this will get reworked when this becomes the more prototypical Olson Pit in the future. I have another little bitty mine hidden in one of my helixes. There was a storage track here that I wasn't using for anything. Decided that if I put ore cars back in there, it'd be a great place to stash a couple extra that I could pull out at an operating session as needed. That's the track that is the hidden track, and the ore cars sit back there. When that switch is thrown, the man with the lantern, that lantern lights up so you can see where you're going to go get your ore cars. So that takes care of 6 mines. Those 6 mines can produce 32 to 36 ore cars per session. They have to go somewhere. Otherwise, I'd only have part of the equation done. So I had to have some mills. So my mills are at the town called Millburg. And here's the first one, the Republic Mill. This complex anchors one corner of my railroad room and really try to draw the viewer in here. So there's some things about the construction I want to talk about. The building in the brown building is wood, and the first mill would have been built out of wood. As the mill grew and they needed to expand it, some years later, they would have probably built out of something else like metal. And so to get a metal look, again, I used Foamcore on this. I attached these beveled pieces of balsa to make a very thick corrugated metal, painted it silver, weathered it up, and sandwiched it in next to the other building to show that this thing is growing. The other thing I did here is the water tank is an O-scale water tank, makes a nice small compact water tank for my locomotives, and the engine house was from a garden railway, and I tucked them in real close. Now, around Ellensburg, there should have been lots of space, so why wasn't this stuff all spread out? Well, it was when it started, but when the add-on came, rather than move the water tank and move the engine house, they just built around it. That works really great for a modeler that doesn't have as much room as they would like to have to tuck all this stuff together and make it logical. So that's why this model specifically shows 2 different kinds of construction tucked in around the railroad. Some other things, that stack in the back says Republic Milling Company on it. That's a turned wooden table leg. There's another piece of the trainscapes from Cox HO models. used as a conveyor there. That makes part of the scene. And this is filled with valves and pipes and tanks. And all of the valves are from Western scale models who used to produce this in O scale. They had a number of castings. I bought several of their casting kits and got different pipes and valves and elbows and joints. And I bought a number of different tanks from different places. And I put all that stuff together, and then I built a building to support it. So the mill may look like it was there first and the tanks came after. In reality, the tanks came first, and I wanted to support all of those neat fittings in a way that they were easy to see in those tanks. And then I built the building to support those. So I kind of built this backwards to get the look I'm looking for. There's also electrical wires here, because this would have been powered by electricity. There's lots of pipes running back and forth that may or may not have done anything in reality, but what they do on the model is they draw your eye around to the scene where I want you to look. And so the pipes are very much a part of the model, and a really important part. That's the Republic Mill. Right next to it is the Washington Zinc Works. This was a mill built after the extension on the other one, and that's why this one is all metal. The main building parts came from a plastic HO scale steel mill, those pipes and a lot of the styrene. But I also used some mountains and minutes. They had a building series, and there's some pieces of the roof came from that. And again, basically put all these different pieces together in the space that I had to build the building that I wanted to build that would support the number of ore cars that I was using. I use lots of different things from other scales. I talked about the mountains and minutes pieces and the Western scale model pieces and Plastistruct. There is a transformer there that was a ground power station in HO, I think by Heike. Becomes a great building transformer in my scale and allows me to connect all my buildings with some wires there to make it look like I'm in the 1930s and everything is electrical powered. Other thing to note about that building is 2/3 of it are flat painted on the backdrop. The only part of that that's 3D is from the arrow forward. Everything else is painted on the backdrop to look like it goes back into the wall there. That makes up the two mills. High-grade ore is the product that gets produced, and that ore goes into sacks. And it's been a good year at the mill here, and so there's a whole bunch of sacks of ore that need to be transported down to the standard gauge. A couple other things on that picture. Mill supply is where supplies come into that mill and where that high-grade ore comes out. And just in front of the gentleman standing there holding the clipboard is the scale. Every ore car that comes down needs to be weighed before it can be dumped at the mill to determine what the percentage of ore and all the different pieces, who's going to pay for what. So a lot happens at this building. What happens that's most important, though, is that the sacks of high-grade ore are no longer out in the open. They're put into a covered hopper. These are covered hoppers that I've got 4 of these and can be secured so that the train can then take them down to the standard gauge interchange at North Ellensburg. There's the standard gauge interchange at North Ellensburg. If you're at all familiar with Eastern Washington, the columnar basalts, you can see the columnar basalts in the background. The Milwaukee and the Northern Pacific ran right through this area. If you know where Thorpe is, my mythical North Ellensburg is right near Thorpe. I found decals for Milwaukee before I found decals for the Northern Pacific. So I've got a Milwaukee interchange here. That is a 32nd scale standard gauge 40-foot boxcar. And it helped people understand how big this model is. Those are the covered hoppers, covered guns in the foreground there where the high-grade ore is. Because at times some of the high-grade ore would go missing, it was important to have a Pinkerton guard. There's the Pinkerton guard there, making sure that nothing happens to the high-grade ore. Once it went on to the Milwaukee, it would go across the mountains to Tacoma and end up in the Asarco mill. And that's prototypical. At the Asarco mill, it would be reduced and the profits would come back to the bank. the bank at North Ellensburg. Because we're in the 1930s, just after the Depression's, the worst of the Depression, my story is that the bank had been closed down during the banking crisis, just getting reopened. It's a great place for all the money from my mines to go. At the same time, we're getting a new paint job because things had fallen into a little bit of disrepair. This is a resin building, an O-scale resin building from Grand Central Gems. By changing the number of mullions in the windows and making a new door, putting it up on this little rock outcropping, I was able to create a nice little bank for my railroad with a full interior, including a safe and a teller's cage to make sure that we do a good job of protecting the interests of the mine owner. That's me. Last piece of information here is that the Consolidated Republic is good to its employees. If you operate for the day, you get a 5-cent script from the company. That means you can spend that 5 cents in the company store, put it in the company bank, or spend it at the one company supported tavern there in town. I've been giving those 5-cent scripts away for a while and realized that I needed to raise some money for my other mining interests, the Olson Pit. And quite common when mining companies needed a little bit of extra money, they would reorganize, they would produce stock. So now my operators can take the option of taking the 10-cent stock in lieu of the 5-cent script. And if you look in the fine print, it's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Consolidated Republic Mining, and it's payable on demand if the Olson Pit Mine ever shows a profit. That's the story of the Consolidated Republic Mining Railway.
Thank you very much, Greg. Do we have any questions from the group?
Yes, I do. It sounds like the mills produced concentrate, and the concentrate then had to go to a smelter. Now, for the Republic area, would there have been a smelter in Spokane also?
To my knowledge, Spokane never had a smelter. The smelter was up in just north of the border in BC. My prototype mine is near Ellensburg, Washington, so it would have been quicker to take it over the mountain to the smelters in Tacoma or Everett. And so that's the way I set mine up. If it was even bigger mining area, they could have had their own smelter, but this was not big enough for its own. My area that I'm modeling is not big enough for its own smelter.
The ore in Republic, was that totally millable, or did they have to do some chemical processing to extract it from the ore also?
Probably both. The typical process, you had to crush it to get down as fine as possible. So the ore that goes through a mill is like flour, very, very fine, not like what comes out of the ground. And then it was usually a mixture of mechanical and chemical processes that got you to the high grade. And then it was heat at the smelter and possibly more chemicals that got you to the final product that you were looking for. And although they call them gold mines or copper mines or silver mines, almost always there was a mixture of metals in those mines, and it would take the different parts out at different points in the smelting process. Also, there was an awful lot of lead in some of those, and if there was too much lead, you actually could get penalized for the amount of lead that you had in your ore instead of getting money for it.
Are there any tunnel mines in Liberty? I've been up there. They have used to have a wonderful gold get together in August, but are there any tunnel mines in Liberty that someone can get to without a four-wheel drive?
I don't think so. You're right about Liberty is that ghost town in central Washington, and that's kind of the model of where I'm planned to do my modeling. Liberty was mostly placer mines, meaning they were getting it out of the streams, but there were a few small underground mines, very small in size. That one picture I showed. There's a number of people looked, but never really found the big lode at Liberty that would have been producing the amounts that I'm looking for. So my story is that somebody found the big lode at Liberty, and we started mining it. There's a number of good books on mining in Central Washington that talk about that story. If you go over Blewett Pass towards Wenatchee, once you cross to the other side of the pass, there are a number of mines and mining properties all along the highway there that had a good bit of ore taken out of them over the years.
I was in one mine up there just outside of Liberty, underground tunneling, but it's in gravel that is so consolidated they didn't even need to put up support.
Probably went in, a short distance. The mines that I built would be the deep style mines, similar to what might be over in northern Idaho, a mile deep in some places. So I'm trying to give the idea, I break away from history, but at least I have a location to start, and then try to give the idea that it was a big time mining complex that was going on there, not just a little one person, one horse mine. I was really going after a 1930s mining operation that had reached the size that it really needed its own railroad.
Greg, could you say something about the track and rolling stock?
Sure. I didn't cover any of the rolling stock, but 1/32nd scale is my scale. That's twice what S scale is, 1/32nd scale. I was figured out by accident that 1/32nd scale, if you put a scale rule on HO track, it was 20 inches. And so that was close enough to 24 inches that became my scale, my gauge. So I'm working in 1/32nd scale, or 3/8, they're interchangeable, and 20. So 20 inches is my gauge. What that does for me is I can use HO gauge track and switches, and I can use mechanisms. I can also use ON30, which is HO gauged. So I use that for my mechanisms, and I hand lay a lot of my track, but in areas where the track is not close to the front of the layout, I'll use HO flex track and just put in really deep ballast so you can't see the ties.
And how about those mining cars?
Didn't have very many pictures of those, but my gill pin style cars are kitbashed from O-scale ore jimmies, like the ones that run around the Great Lakes. That gave me the metal bodies. And if you look closely at the gill pins, what they did is they took they bought a metal body, and then they bolted wooden platforms on each end. And that's what I've done is I buy these models, I cut them down severely and scratch built the wooden platforms. The Pinos Altos did something similar. They bought steel bodies from somewhere, and they put them on a steel frame instead. And so I buy different O-scale ore jimmies for those, and put them on a scratch-built frame and run them around. So that's where most of my ore cars came from. The first ore cars I built were side dumps. I scratch-built those out of wood. I have 6 of those that still run around the railroad. The original 2, the sides actually opened and were hinged, but they kept opening at the wrong time and catching on scenery and stuff. So eventually, when I built more, they weren't all hinged at that point. I use ON30 Bachmann wheels, trucks for those cars, and on some of the other cars I used Grantline ON3 with the wheels pushed in. I use KDO scale couplers. They're standard gauge coupler, gives me about a 3/4 size coupler, which would have been probably prototypical. Most prototypical would have been Lincoln pin, but trying to operate that would have been a disaster. So I went with the KD couplers, and I'm really happy with that decision.
Greg, I got the information you were asking about for the SW1. It was bought by GN in September 1941 and operated until the merger, and then was sold, and I will go into the 3 or 4 times. It actually came in 1977. It actually came back to the BNSF in 1980, and then stayed there until March of 2001 when it was sold to Borax, where I'm guessing they added the air conditioning.
Yep. And that What-
As far
That
as I
pic-
know, that's where it still is.
and that picture was from 2003, I think, and it was working in the Boron Pit down for US Borax.
Hey, Greg, where was that locomotive that covered wagon you had the picture of had Seattle written on it? What's the story on that?
That there's a museum down at Skamania on the Columbia River, and it's a transportation and other museum. It's a very strange combination of transportation, logging, mining, local farming history, local Native American history, and some religious history. And it's down there at Skamania, and it's got a beautiful interior building with a big fish wheel and all sorts of beautiful displays in it. Talks about the geology. But outside they have logging trucks, logging equipment, and some railroad equipment. And that's an SP&S, I think probably an FA that's sitting there along with an SP&S caboose that we got able to take pictures with.
My comment was that Greg has some very interesting locomotives.
Hi, Jerry. Yeah, all of my locomotives, they're all geared locomotives, heavily kit bashed or scratch built. When I'm bored, I look for weird geared locomotives to build, and I found a few of those, and they're built off of the HO or ON30 mechanisms, but basically from the mechanism up, they're completely scratch built. I enjoy doing the building. That's part of the reason that I really liked this scale, is everything is either heavily kit bashed or scratch built, and that's the kind of modeling I like to do. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Hello again. This is another reminder that this virtual layout tour has been brought to you by members of the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And we want to encourage you to, again, find out about the NMRA online. Both PNR and NMRA have an excellent website where you can get information about joining and participating in this and other activities like our clinics that are held all over the region. So thank you for joining us today, and wish you great modeling.